Now, listen to me closely, because this story, it didn't happen in the light of day. It happened in a time when the Georgia air was so thick with humidity and pride, you could almost taste the iron. The year was 1844. In Atlanta, your name wasn't just a word, it was a fortress. And if that fortress crumbled, you didn't just lose your money, you lost your humanity. Welcome to Oak Haven. To the world, it was the jewel of the county, all white columns and the sweet, suffocating scent of jasmine. But beneath the manicured lawns, the soil was saturated with human sweat and secrets. Ruling this kingdom was a woman who was less a mother and more an institution, Mrs. Eleanor Vance. She was 50 years old, sharp as a rusted blade, and lived in a constant, quiet terror that a single smudge on the Vance name would ruin her. But her greatest fear wasn't a bad harvest. It was her own blood. Her daughter Clara, a 19-year-old vision of honey, colored hair and a restlessness that no sermon could beat out of her. You see, in 1844, a lady's purity was the linchpin of the Southern economy. And tonight, we tell the story of what happens when that linchpin snaps, and a mother decides that her daughter is no longer a child, but a criminal to be broken. The institution of Eleanor Vance was not merely a matter of personal identity, but a calculated performance of power designed to uphold the social order of 1844 Atlanta. She moved through the grand halls of Oak Haven with a posture that suggested royalty, ensuring that every silk fold of her gown was crisp and every silver spoon mirrored her own cold perfection. To Eleanor, a woman's worth was a fragile currency minted entirely from the public's perception of her moral purity and her family's unyielding stability. She viewed herself as the guardian of an ancient flame, believing that any flicker of weakness in her character would invite the total collapse of her household. Consequently, her life was a series of rigid rituals where spontaneity was treated as a dangerous vice and reputation was guarded with a ferocity that bordered on the divine. This obsession turned her heart into a vault, where only the cold logic of social standing was allowed to reside, leaving no room for the softness of maternal instinct. Her authority over the estate was absolute, enforced by a hand that rarely trembled, even when delivering the most brutal of commands to her subordinates and staff. Eleanor did not see Oak Haven as a home, but as a fortification against the encroaching chaos of a changing world that she deeply feared and misunderstood. She operated on the belief that if the hierarchy of the plantation were to be questioned even once, the very ground beneath her feet would turn into a swallowing abyss. Every interaction she had with the neighboring elite was a tactical maneuver intended to reinforce the Vance name as the gold standard of Southern aristocracy. She understood that power in the South was not just about the acreage one owned, but about the silent, terrifying respect one could command from both peers and those she considered property. To maintain this, she sacrificed her sleep and her peace, becoming a permanent sentinel who watched for the slightest crack in the fortress she had spent decades building. Clara, her only daughter, was viewed less as a person and more as the ultimate project, the one piece of living art that had to be perfect to ensure the lineage. Eleanor saw Clara's honey-colored hair and restless eyes not as traits of a developing woman, but as assets that needed to be brokered to the highest bidder in society. Every lesson in pianoforte and every sharp tap of her fan against Clara's wrist was a reminder that the girl was meant to be a mirror image of Eleanor's own icy resolve. The mother lived in a state of constant, quiet paranoia, sensing that Clara's independent spirit was a defect that could potentially tarnish the sterling silver reputation of the Vance family name. To Eleanor, a daughter's primary duty was to be an invisible pillar, a silent extension of the family's greatness who would eventually marry well and continue the cycle of rigid, performative excellence. She could not fathom a world where Clara had desires of her own, as such things were irrelevant to the grand, cold architecture of the life Eleanor had meticulously designed. The physical layout of Oak Haven was a direct reflection of Eleanor's mental landscape, where every boundary was a chasm enforced by law, custom, and the ever-present threat of violence. She took immense pride in the white columns and the scent of jasmine that masked the darker realities of the deep, rich soil that sustained her immense wealth and comfort. The quarter-mile distance between the main house and the slave quarters was, in her mind, a sacred line that no respectable white woman would ever dream of crossing or even acknowledging. She moved through her gardens with a detached grace, ignoring the humanity of those who worked the fields while simultaneously demanding their absolute, groveling obedience at all times. For Eleanor, the world was a collection of things to be managed, and any entity that it did not fit perfectly into its preordained slot was a problem that needed to be solved with iron. This spatial and social segregation was her masterpiece, a delicate but deadly balance that she believed made her the most sophisticated woman in all of Georgia. As the sun set over the estate, Eleanor would often stand by her window, looking out over her kingdom with a sense of triumph that was entirely devoid of any actual joy or warmth. She was a woman who had traded the capacity for love for the security of a title, finding her only solace in the fact that her name remained whispered with reverence in Atlanta's parlors. She mistook the fear she inspired in others for respect, and she mistook her own inner emptiness for the stoic strength required of a true lady of the South. Her entire existence was a high-stakes gamble on the idea that as long as the surface of the Vance life remained polished, the rot beneath would never be seen by the world. This was the institution of Eleanor Vance, a woman who would eventually prove she was willing to burn down the heart of her own family to ensure the columns of her house remained white. She was the architect of her own isolation, a queen who would rather rule over a cemetery of broken spirits than acknowledge a single truth that threatened her cold and hollow crown. The seeds of suspicion that had been germinating in Eleanor's mind finally bloomed into a cold, dark reality on the night she discovered the secret of the tobacco shed. Driven by a maternal paranoia that felt more like a predatory hunt, she bypassed the formal gardens and moved toward the forbidden perimeter, where the manicured lawns dissolved into the rough quarters. Every step she took away from the main house felt like a transgression against her own status, yet the lure of the truth was a force she could no longer resist. She kept to the deep shadows of the ancient oaks, her dark silk gown snagging on the overgrown brambles that guarded the path like silent, tangled sentinels of the night. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, not out of fear for her daughter's safety, but out of an agonizing dread for the family's sterling reputation. The air grew thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, signaling that she was approaching the derelict structure that sat on the very edge of the woods. Eleanor pressed her body against the rough, splintered wood of the shed, her breath shallow as she sought a point of entry for her prying, judgmental eyes. She found a narrow crack in the planks, just wide enough to reveal the flickering, amber light of a single, smoky oil lamp burning within the cramped interior. What she saw inside was not a romantic rendezvous with a forbidden suitor, which she had prepared herself to punish with a simple, quiet exile. Instead, she witnessed a scene of intellectual insurrection that defied every law of nature and society she had been taught to uphold since her own sheltered childhood. Her daughter sat upon an overturned barrel, her face illuminated by a radiant focus that Eleanor had never seen during the boring rounds of high society teas. Surrounding Clara were 5 young men, their faces slick with sweat and concentration, as they leaned toward the girl with a shared, desperate hunger for something forbidden. In Clara's hand was a small piece of white chalk, and before the men sat a crudely cut slate that served as a makeshift gateway to a dangerous world. Eleanor watched in paralyzed horror as her daughter traced the shapes of the alphabet, teaching these men the very symbols that could eventually dismantle the entire plantation economy. This was not a mere breach of household rules. It was a criminal act of treason against the state of Georgia and the very foundation of the Southern way of life. The sight of Clara's fingers touching the slate felt like a physical assault on Eleanor's senses, as if each letter drawn was a crack in the white columns of Oak Haven. She saw the tall man Moses point to a character with a look of sudden, sharp comprehension that made Eleanor's blood run as cold as the winter river. To her, this was not an act of charity or kindness, but a calculated betrayal that threatened to arm the property with the deadliest weapon imaginable. The intimacy of the scene was what truly broke Eleanor's composure, as she observed the easy, human communion that existed between the teacher and her captive students. Clara's radiant smile was a gift she had never bestowed upon the wealthy bachelors who had come to court her in the formal parlor of the grand mansion. There was no fear in the shed, only a shared sense of excitement and a dangerous equality that suggested the rigid barriers of 1844 had been momentarily dissolved. Eleanor felt a wave of blinding, righteous fury wash over her, scalding her soul and replacing her shock with a cold, metallic need for absolute and total destruction. She realized that the secrets held within this small, dirt-floored shack were powerful enough to burn her entire world to the ground if they were ever allowed to escape. The shared humanity on display was a direct challenge to her race, her class, and every lesson of propriety she had used to define her existence. As she stepped back to plan her next move, Eleanor's foot caught on a protruding root, and she stumbled heavily against the flimsy wooden wall with a sharp, echoing thud. Inside the shed, the low murmur of voices vanished instantly, and the flickering light of the lamp became a static, terrifying glow in the sudden, oppressive silence. Eleanor knew she had been discovered, but she also knew that as the mistress of Oak Haven, she held the ultimate power over the terrified souls within. She did not flee into the darkness. Instead, she straightened her posture and summoned the full, terrifying weight of her institutional authority to the forefront of her being. She raised her hand and slammed it against the door 3 times, the sound mimicking the finality of a judge's gavel as she prepared to shatter their lives. With a voice that cut through the humid night air like a whip, she commanded the door to be opened, signaling the end of the secret and the beginning of the nightmare. The main yard of Oak Haven was transformed into a theater of calculated horror as iron torches cast long, flickering shadows against the pristine white columns of the mansion. Eleanor stood atop the grand veranda, a silhouette of frozen fury, demanding that the entire enslaved community gather to witness the ritualistic dismantling of her own daughter's status. The air was thick with the scent of burning oil and the palpable terror of 90 souls who knew that a midnight summoning heralded only the most extreme of punishments. In the center of the yard stood the 5 men, bound in heavy iron shackles that jingled with a mournful, rhythmic finality as they were forced toward the whipping post. But the true shock that stole the breath of every witness was the sight of Miss Clara, the jewel of the estate, standing in the dirt like a common criminal, This was the moment Eleanor chose to prove that the laws of the South were more sacred than the bonds of her own flesh and blood. Eleanor's voice cut through the humid night like a blade of ice, declaring like a great wickedness had been discovered in the very heart of their world. She addressed the trembling crowd not as a mother, but as a judge, labeling the pursuit of literacy as a theft of the tools of rebellion and social chaos. To Eleanor, the crime of the 5 men was significant, but it paled in comparison to the treason committed by the daughter who had forgotten the sacred duty of her lineage. She looked down at Clara, who stood small and defeated in the dust, and announced that the shame was public, and therefore the correction must be public as well. The assembly watched in a stunned, suffocating silence, realizing that the mistress was about to shatter every social norm to maintain the iron grip of her authority. There was no mercy in her gaze, only the terrifying resolve of a woman who believed that blood must be spilled to wash away the stain of disobedience. The command to prepare the whipping post for a white woman of Clara's standing was an order so shocking that even the hardened overseer, Silas, hesitated for a fleeting moment. Eleanor silenced his doubt with a low, lethal threat, asserting that she was the law of Oak Haven and that her judgment was the final word on these grounds. Clara's desperate plea for mercy, reminding her mother of their bond, was met with a cold stare that suggested the girl was now merely a body to be corrected. Silas moved with a grim, nervous speed, first binding the men to the post to serve as the brutal opening act of the night's horrific spectacle. Each man took 20 lashes, the wet crack of leather meeting skin echoing across the yard, and silencing the natural sounds of the Georgia night. Clara was forced to watch as the men she had befriended were broken, knowing with a cold dread that her turn at the post was only moments away. When the men were unchained and left huddled in the dirt, Eleanor descended the steps to ensure the final act of the degradation was performed with clinical perfection. Under the harsh, flickering torchlight, Clara was stripped of her fine silk dress and reduced to a simple, thin cotton shift that offered no protection from the coming fire. The shame was immediate and overwhelming, as the daughter of the house was handled with the same rough indifference as the property she had tried to elevate. She was led to the post, her wrists bound tightly to the splintered wood, positioning her back toward the mother who had presided over her total social ruin. Eleanor returned to her high vantage point on the veranda, a silent witness to the destruction she had authorized to preserve the sanctity of the Vance name. Every person present internalizing the message that at Oak Haven, power was absolute, and even the mistress's own blood was not exempt from the lash. The whip descended with a sickening thud, carving a line of fire across Clara's back and blooming a vivid crimson stain on the white cotton of her shift. Eleanor watched each strike with the detached intensity of a surgeon, her jaw set in a rigid line that refused to betray a single spark of maternal grief. Clara bit her lip until it bled, struggling to remain silent, but by the 10th stroke, her defiance dissolved into raw, animalistic sobs that tore through the night air. The enslaved community watched this unprecedented violence with a mixture of pity and terror, seeing the blood of their owner's daughter spilled in the same dirt as their own. When the 20th lash finally fell, a profound and hollow silence settled over the yard, leaving Clara hanging limp against the post she had shared with the condemned. Eleanor stood victorious over the broken spirit of her child, having successfully traded her daughter's love for the cold, unyielding security of an iron social order. The martyrdom of Jonas began in the quiet, smelling stalls of the stables, where he had served the Vance family with a silent, observant dignity for over 2 decades. When Clara approached him, her back still raw from the lash and her eyes burning with a desperate, newfound clarity, he recognized the gravity of the request she carried. Jonas understood that helping a runaway white woman was an act of incomprehensible treason that would likely cost him his life. Yet he chose to strike a final blow against the system. He took the stolen Vance heirlooms, those pearls and sapphires that represented the very wealth built upon his own labor, and rode into the heart of Atlanta. In the shadows of the city, he negotiated with a network of free men, trading the jewelry for a train ticket and a promise of passage on a ship called the Freedom. He returned to Oak Haven under the cover of a midnight storm, handing Clara the means to escape while the rest of the house lay in a deceptive, heavy sleep. While Clara made her terrifying descent to the first floor, slipping through the back door like a ghost, Jonas remained behind to face the inevitable consequence of his loyalty. He did not attempt to flee, knowing that his absence would only quicken the hunt and potentially lead the overseer directly to the path Clara had taken toward the city. When Silas and the riders burst into his small cabin, Jonas stood with a calm that unnerved the men who had come to bind him in cold, rattling iron. He was dragged back to the main yard, the very place where he had witnessed Clara's public humiliation, to face the final judgment of a woman who viewed his kindness as a theft. Eleanor met him in the pre-dawn gray, her face a mask of stone that showed no room for the 20 years of faithful service he had given her. She did not ask for his reasons, for to her, the motivations of property were irrelevant to the absolute necessity of maintaining the plantation's rigid and unforgiving order. The execution of Jonas was a swift and brutal affair, designed to be the final, terrifying punctuation mark on the rebellion that had sprouted within the walls of Oak Haven. Eleanor stood on the veranda and watched as the rope was prepared, her silence a chilling command that the life of the stablemaster be extinguished before the sun could rise. Jonas looked at the mistress one last time, his voice steady as he told her that the girl deserved her freedom, a truth that Eleanor could not permit to exist. As the life left his body, he became a martyr for a cause he would never see come to fruition. His death a sacrifice meant to buy Clara the hours she needed. The enslaved community watched from the shadows of their cabins, internalizing the sight of the man who had been the backbone of the stables, now swinging as a warning. Eleanor did not turn away, ensuring that the cost of helping her daughter was branded into the memory of every living soul who remained on her land. Immediately following the deed, Eleanor mounted her dark stallion, her grief over her daughter's flight replaced by a predatory need to reclaim the property that had dared to walk away. She pushed her horse toward the Atlanta rail lines with a reckless abandon that disregarded her own safety and the exhaustion of the men riding desperately behind her. She was a woman possessed, fueled by the metallic taste of betrayal and the realization that her perfect facade was crumbling with every mile Clara put between them. In her mind, Jonas was merely a hurdle she had cleared, and the focus of her fury was now entirely fixed on the daughter who had stolen the family's future. She rode through the morning mist like a dark spirit of the Old South, determined to intercept the morning train before it could carry the Vance name into the unknown. The hunt was no longer about discipline or motherly concern. It was a high-stakes battle for the very survival of the institutional power Eleanor had spent her life cultivating. The race ended at the Atlanta station, a chaotic hub of steam and steel where the worlds of the plantation and the burgeoning industrial city collided in a roar of noise. Eleanor arrived just as the whistle sounded, Her horse lathered in sweat as she scanned the windows of the departing cars with a frantic, unforgiving intensity. She spotted Clara's pale face behind the glass and felt a surge of cold, devastating powerlessness as the iron wheels began to turn against the heavy tracks. In that moment, the death of Jonas and the blood in the yard seemed like distant echoes compared to the sight of her daughter's final, silent departure. Eleanor leaped from her horse and ran alongside the accelerating train, screaming for Clara to stop, her elegant clothes now stained with the dust of a failed and desperate pursuit. As the train gained speed, the mistress of Oak Haven was left standing alone on the platform, the master architect of a house that had finally, irrevocably, divided against itself. The great severance of the Vance family was finalized as the train pulled away from the Atlanta station, leaving Eleanor behind in a cloud of steam and shattered illusions. Clara spent the long journey to the coast in a state of hyper-vigilant exhaustion, her back leaning gingerly against the hard wooden seat as she watched the Georgia landscape blur into a green and brown haze. Every rhythmic clack of the wheels against the iron rails felt like a heartbeat pushing her further from the reach of the woman who had traded a daughter for a reputation. She reached the salt, thick air of Savannah late that evening, moving through the bustling port city with the quiet, focused invisibility of someone who had already been erased from her previous life. The massive clipper ship, the Freedom, waited at the docks like a towering promise of a world where her mother's iron rules carried no weight or authority. She handed her remaining jewels to the ship's captain, a man who saw only the value of the stones and cared nothing for the blood that had been spilled to secure them. As the sails unfurled and caught the Atlantic wind, Clara sat in the darkness of the deck, watching the lights of the southern coast slowly dissolve into the vast, black horizon. She touched the ridges of the scars on her back through the thin fabric of her travel dress, realizing they were the only true inheritance she would ever carry from Oak Haven. The physical pain had settled into a dull, constant ache, but it served as a grounding reminder that she was no longer a decorative asset in a mother's cold and calculating social game. She was heading toward an uncertain future in the north, where she would be a woman without a name, a fortune, or a home, but possessed of a terrifying and beautiful liberty. The ocean air felt clean and sharp in her lungs, a stark contrast to the suffocating, jasmine-scented atmosphere of the plantation that had tried to bury her spirit in a grave of propriety. She was a fugitive from her own blood, a thief of her own life, and for the first time in 19 years, she was the sole author of her own destiny. Back at Oak Haven, Eleanor Vance set about the grim and meticulous task of constructing a final, unbreakable narrative to explain the sudden and permanent absence of her only heir. She sat at her mahogany desk and wrote letters to the social elite of Atlanta, weaving a tragic tale of a sudden, debilitating nervous fever that had required Clara's immediate transfer to a private sanitarium. She maintained the facade with a terrifyingly perfect composure, wearing the black silk of mourning for a year to symbolize a loss that was, in truth, a self-inflicted wound to the heart of her family. No one dared to question the mistress of the estate, for her eyes held a cold, predatory light that warned against even the slightest inquiry into the dark secrets hidden behind the white columns. She scrubbed the memory of the whipping post and the hanging tree from the conversation of the house, ensuring that the silence of Oak Haven was as absolute as its pristine, manicured beauty. Eleanor had saved the Vance name from the stain of a public scandal, but in doing so, she had turned her home into a hollow monument to a dead and buried past. As the years drifted by, The isolation of the estate began to weigh upon Eleanor like a physical shroud, though she never once allowed her rigid posture to slacken in the face of her loneliness. She moved through the grand, silent rooms like a ghost of the old order, surrounded by silver that remained polished and gardens that remained perfect, yet devoid of any living warmth or laughter. She received sympathetic callers in her parlor and served tea with the same measured grace she had always possessed, playing the part of the stoic matriarch until the role became her entire, empty reality. Late at night, when the cicadas sang their loudest, she would walk the halls of the mansion, listening for the sound of a door latch or a soft footfall that she knew would never come. She had won the battle for her reputation and the preservation of her class, but she had paid the ultimate price by sacrificing the only person who had ever truly belonged to her. The iron rules she had fought so viciously to uphold had finally consumed her, leaving her as the solitary keeper of a beautiful, opulent, and utterly silent cage. In the end, the story of the Lady of Oak Haven was not one of triumph, but a haunting testament to the devastating cost of choosing power over humanity in the unforgiving South. Clara lived out her days in the North, a woman whose true history was hidden beneath the simple clothes of a common laborer, yet whose spirit remained unbowed by the weight of her scars. Eleanor remained a pillar of society until her final breath, a woman respected and feared by all, yet known by none, a statue of a bygone era frozen in a pose of absolute and hollow victory. The white columns of the estate stood as a reminder that some fortunes are built on foundations too brittle to survive the truth, and some names are saved only by destroying everything they were meant to represent. The great house remained a landmark of Atlanta's history, but its legacy was one of blood, silence, and the eternal distance between a mother's pride and a daughter's soul. The story closed not with a reconciliation, but with the chilling echo of a choice that could never be undone, a finality that resonated through the empty halls of Oak Haven forever.